I hate clean air and water. I don't care how much companies pollute rivers and streams. I don't even like trees. I just care about tax cuts. Who am I? Well, that's easy. I'm a conservative.
I'm not willing to call Caitlyn Jenner a she.
Oh.
Because you can't change your sex. You can change your name.
Right.
You can change your name to whatever you want. I don't care. But you can't. Caitlyn Jenner is not a chicken. Caitlyn Jenner is not a woman. Caitlyn Jenner is a man. A biological man.
And as this is the first episode, I do want to take a bit of time to introduce you to the podcast and tell you what it's all about. Okay, so I created this podcast because I wanted to offer my voice as sort of a counter to some of the groups and some of the individuals, mostly on YouTube, that are part of the alt-right rabbit hole. There's actually another great podcast about that called Down the Rabbit Hole, which is very good to listen to if you haven't heard of this before. But as my target audience is hopefully boys and young men around my age, I'm 19 by the way, who have sort of fallen or almost fallen into this rabbit hole, listen to some of these people on YouTube, people like Ben Shapiro, people like Jordan Peterson, who, as I'll talk about much later, are very, they are very smooth talkers. They aren't all that you might think they are. And I hope to sort of deconstruct and debunk some of the misinformation that is getting put out. And this is a political podcast. I will be challenging, ideas as well, whether or not they are necessarily, objectively wrong or not, or even if such a thing exists. I think that many people in my demographic are feeling sort of lost and unsure of what to believe in, sort of struggling to find a purpose in life, or sort of a calling, something to believe in and fight for. And I think many of us find that in these influential, conservative, far-right people or groups, but they offer some rather dangerous ideology with it. I don't mean dangerous in the sense that it's challenging the system. I think that's a good thing. That's what I'm here to do with this podcast as well. I mean dangerous in the sense that they actually harm other people, particularly minorities. And I mean that not necessarily in a statistical sense, disempowered groups. For example, women, people of color, queer people, stuff like that. There's very real consequences that happens as a result of this thinking, and that's my purpose in making this. Hopefully I can do some good by making this podcast. A few disclaimers. I want to make it clear that this is a political podcast done by me, and hopefully a guest if I can find one for any of my episodes. And if that's not your thing, you don't have to listen to this, but I will say that I hope my audience is one that is open to listening to the other side and looking for ways in which that the people they really listen to and they really find influential, looking for criticisms of them. That's how I ended up completely changing the people that I listen to, because I wanted to see if there was any counters to what they were talking about, and lo and behold, there were quite a few. And I'm thinking, well, what if there's going to be counters to the people I'm listening to nowadays? So who knows? I think it's good to remain open-minded. So I hope that you listen to me, even though this is admittedly going to be a podcast with ideology, and a podcast with politics and such. Something that is going to be biased. Okay, another thing I want to disclaim is that I'm not an expert. This is coming from the perspective of an ordinary 19-year-old kid, just like you, or presumably just like you. I still consider myself a kid. There's so much that I don't know and so much I have to learn. So I don't presume that I know what I'm talking about. This is just a matter of not necessarily even opinion. I hesitate to say what I have are opinions, just sort of impressions of what I think is going on in this country, in the world right now. And another disclaimer: this podcast is created as part of a college class, so there's that. This is something that I want to do truly and honestly. I do, but it is for a class. So will I carry it on for seasons and seasons and dozens of episodes? Maybe not. But I just wanted to make that information available to you. And last but not least, as a disclaimer, my intro that you heard uses a segment from PragerU, which is a YouTube channel I'll be talking about later. As you might guess, they are very problematic, but I'll talk about that later. And I did take that clip deliberately out of context, but as I'll talk about later, it is, in sort of an ironic way, actually true what that guy is talking about with not caring about the environment. But it's more complicated, so it deserves its own episode. But yes, I did. That clip is, he was being sarcastic in that clip. Ben Shapiro, though, wasn't. But we'll talk about him in a different episode as well. For this episode, I will be discussing the YCPT, Yavapai County Preparedness Team, and the Prescott Oath Keepers, which, as I'll talk about, they're almost synonymous, although not quite. This is a first episode special. I'm talking about a much more local issue rather than a national issue, but if you want to think in sort of a, inductive, I believe an inductive way, where you take a specific example and make a generalization, this could be useful in that regard, because it does give us a lens into a very conservative leaning and very terrified community, as we'll see up here in the Prescott, Arizona area, particularly Chino Valley, but the whole Prescott Quad Cities area as well. To break it down to you, the Yavapai County Preparedness Team held a meeting in July, mid-July, I believe, on the 15th or the day before, something like that. And the topic that they discussed a few things, but the main topic was Prescott College's hiring, although technically she's been hired since 2018, of Patrice Kohlers, who, if you don't know, is a co-founder of Black Lives Matter. And this simple act really upset a lot of people. If you look in if you're watching on YouTube, you'll see in the art I made for this episode, there's some quotes here that are taken from Facebook, as the little logo implies. These are things that were actually said and posted in reaction to Patrice Kohlers not actually being hired, but teaching a new master's program, I believe is what it is. But the point is, the community became aware of Patrice Kohlers working at Prescott College, the local community, the Prescott community. Now, as you can see, some people are very hostile, making threats, and this isn't acceptable speech. You cannot be making, implying, these threats of violence. So it was something that I sent emails to some of the individuals who made the more threatening speech to their workplace, informing their employers, saying, "Hey, you might not want this person here." That was something that we actually all did. Many of us students did in reaction to this. But that's just on Facebook. The more, how do I put it, organized speech came from the Yavapai County Preparedness Team in this meeting that I'm about to review. So what I'm going to be doing is reviewing this meeting. It was a full 2-hour meeting, so I've just taken some clips from it that I thought were interesting and warranted some words from myself and my thoughts about this. I wish I had someone else to discuss this with, but it's just me this time. And of course, also be giving my broader thoughts over the reaction from the local community about this situation, as I already did with the Facebook situation. And just to be clear about the art for this episode, those quotes are from Facebook. The guy you see pictured, his name is Jim Arroyo, and I'll be talking about him as well, but he did not say these things. Just want to make that clear. This is from Facebook. That's why there's a big F there. But I mean, these are, people of the same community. It's just that some are less, speak in more softer terms than others. So I want to make that clear. Like, sometimes, people are aware of their speech and they do keep it within their own communities. But we will get a very good look through this meeting at the way these people think and what they're afraid of. I'm going to talk about the meeting now before I get into it. So the main points I'm going to take out of this, I'm just give me a minute. I'm just about to start reviewing the meeting. But the main points I'm going to be talking about is the perception of a threat where there is none. In particular, the perception that Black Lives Matter is like an armed and dangerous group, or at least that they are promoting others or associated with them, as we'll talk about when I get into reviewing the meeting. Just yesterday, I was at a Black Lives Matter protest that happened in Prescott, and who do you think had the assault rifles and the battle armor and stuff like that? It was the counter-protesters, which greatly outnumbered us and surrounded us and, said the things that they said. But the point is, they were scared. They were scared that we were some sort of armed group, when in reality it was very clearly a bunch of young people going to the local colleges and schools, and then a bunch of older people with a bunch of guns. So that's the reality of it. It's very scary. Without, I don't want to talk about the politics of that, but just the reality of the people who were there, what they were carrying around their shoulders, and compared to us, a smaller. The counter protest was bigger than our own protest. It was rather, the reason they arm themselves is because they feel threatened, but in reality, they're the ones who were very threatening to us. So that, that is the situation, without even getting too political about it at all. Okay, the other main point that they talk about is communism and Marxism as their biggest ideological threats. I won't talk about this too much because I'm not super well versed in communism and Marxism, but there are a few things that I will talk about having to do with those things. And the next one is the belief that there is no problem here in the Prescott area, that racism and white supremacy don't exist. I'll talk about that and why that's not true. And lastly, these are people that have absolute faith in the Constitution above all else, and that sort of logic, I think, is very conservative by nature, that not only Constitution but our laws can't be changed, or they're not subject to change or updating. Some of the things of the Constitution have been in there for hundreds of years, and I just think it's kind of absurd to think that you can't update the laws according to the time period. So I just, I don't think that's a very productive way of thinking as well. That's more of a minor point. Anyway, okay, so the Yavapai County Preparedness Team, what they are a group that specializes in preparing people for disasters, things like EMP strikes, things like, fires, floods, but also things like, what they perceive as an incoming civil war, and armed Marxists or whatever with guns and stuff coming to, burn their churches and destroy their homes or whatever. And they are a public charity, meaning they can apply for grant money, they're tax deductible, and they, present themselves as very defensive, although as I said earlier, for the protest that happened in Prescott, it doesn't really feel defensive when they're the ones that come out very heavily armed, and we're just there with our signs, walking around the courthouse. One more thing I want to say before I finally get started about the Yavapai County Preparedness Team is that I do not disagree with everything they talk about. They talk about a lot of self-sufficiency stuff. independent stuff, which I totally agree with. I consider myself an environmentalist. I'm talking about some more environmental things in future episodes of this podcast. But the YCPT talks about things like water harvesting and just, how to prepare for disasters in general. Like they say, oh, you should have been buying toilet paper before the epidemic hit. They're not really wrong about that. And they say, like, the government is out for its own interests rather than upholding the Constitution. And, I agree. Like, the people in the government are, more often than not, seriously affected by lobbying and payoffs. And, there's no doubt, like, there's corruption. Is it the worst government in the world? No, I don't think so. But the U.S. government is not immune to, being a sellout or corruption and the interests are the interests of the couple hundred people we have in the Congress, rather than the what's written on a piece of paper. So I'm glad they recognize that these people aren't necessarily legalists per se, if that's the right word for it. But anyway, let's finally jump into the first clip I have. So I'm gonna play that now. Hopefully it comes through okay.
Political. So if I say something political, it's under that banner. If it ain't political, it's under that banner. Okay?
Okay, so Jim Arroyo, the presenter at this meeting, is referring to the Oath Keepers banner and the YCPT banner, and one in which he can be political and the other in which he has to be apolitical. And I think, that rubs me the wrong way. It's like an exploit, how he can say, basically what he's saying is he can say political stuff if he wants to. It's just that, he can say political stuff even though he's presenting a meeting that's supposed to be apolitical. It's under a different group that he's a part of. So I think that's kind of an interesting little exploit. I just wanted to point that out. Okay, next clip.
So I was really well indoctrinated on who my foreign enemies were. It was Ivan with the red star. Find the red star, put a bead on it, pull the trigger, done. That's what it was all about. But you know what they never told me was what a domestic enemy was. Not once. So what are domestic enemies? Domestic enemies are those who go against the Constitution of the United States. Right. Your House of Representatives, your U.S. Senate, your local governors, your local mayors. You see what's going on out there. It doesn't take a rocket scientist or a degree from Harvard in political science to figure out that these guys are trying to take down the Constitution and this government. Not on our watch.
Okay, so at the end of that, not on our watch, he made a gesture to his t-shirt, which is the Oath Keepers. I didn't really talk about the Oath Keepers, but from what I understand, they are veterans who sort of have formed, after the fact, after their service. And thank you for your service, by the way. If you've served in the military, that's a very brave thing to do, and I don't, that doesn't go unappreciated, even by, radical leftists like myself. Anyway, so, oh man, I need to re-listen to this.
The United States. Right. Your House of Representatives.
Right, okay. So he's talking about about how Black Lives Matter and sort of associated groups, perhaps leftists in general, are out to sort of take down the Constitution. And I don't really appreciate that absolute statement. I'm not out to take down the Constitution, necessarily, right? Like I said earlier that, I sort of implied earlier that I really believe in updating our laws. I don't think they necessarily have to be, taken down, or I don't think we need to, necessarily have an insurrection, like an armed civil war like this guy is talking about. I do think he blows things out of proportion as to what many of us so-called radical leftists, whether or not we are, depending on your perspective, but whether or not we're actually out to, fight a war is just much more extreme than I think Jim Arroyo would find, the vast majority of us to be. But I just, want to point out how this feeds into the overall narrative that, like, this country is under attack by, domestic terrorists, and that we're going to have a civil war, and, like, you need to buy guns and defend yourself. That's just not what's happening. Like, that's not what I've seen, for the most part, with Black Lives Matter protesting and stuff. That isn't the way it's been in Prescott, with the little protest we had and the very strong reaction we got from the counter protesters. So you already see where the way these people are thinking about the overall situation. He talked about communism as well, but I think I'll talk about that later. Next clip, let's go. Okay, so this next clip is actually a guy who's running for office in Legislative District 1, which is Yavapai County, Arizona. And I don't know his name, unfortunately, but this is somebody different. Actually, I believe his name is Frank something. My bad on that. But anyway, let's hear what he has to say.
I came here today to speak to you about Patrice Cullors, one of the 3 founders of Black Lives Matter, who is currently on the faculty of Prescott College. BLM is founded on the premise that there is systemic institutional racism in our law enforcement agencies. There is no data that can substantiate that. Her background is available on the Prescott College website. You'll find a 3-page CV on that website. You won't believe it.
Okay, so that 3-page introduction was actually screenshotted and was what posted around and led to those very hateful Facebook posts I mentioned earlier. But at this point, he basically says that there's no racial bias in the police force, which I think is silly. And we see these people use statistics in very funny ways. Jim Arroyo comes back and talks about how white people are killed by the police way more than black people, and that's true, actually, looking at the statistics. But both of these guys fail to take account the proportion of it. Black people and people of color in general make up a very small portion of the population. I believe it's 13% for particularly black people are officially classified as African American, I believe. Whereas the death statistics, I don't have the particular numbers with me. Well, they are lower. That's, of course, as a result of there just being much fewer people of color than there are white people in the nation. And when you account for proportionality, yes, people of color are killed by the police more than white people are, and by a significant degree. I think it's somewhere like, I don't have the particular statistics, but it isn't huge. It isn't like 80%, but it is like 20, 30, 10, 20, 30, maybe even 40% more often when you account for proportionality. So I'd say that is pretty good, statistical evidence of bias in the police force. It isn't, it doesn't. There can be more factors to it. It isn't necessarily that way, like theoretically, it could just even be coincidental, but that really doesn't seem to be the case, given that we get more and more cases of racial bias, what appears to be racial bias in the police force. And it is a difficult thing, admittedly, because it's hard to account, to what degree did race play a factor when, Trayvon Martin dies, we get, George Floyd recently, or Jacob Blake, whatever, Breonna Taylor, whoever the victim is, this long list of victims. It's hard to, it's just, it's impossible to statistically say how big of a role race played. But I think it's very clear that race did play a role, and I don't appreciate this and complete dismissal of there is no racial bias in the police force. I think that's just ridiculous. Okay, next clip.
While doing so, they coerced many U.S. corporations, and this could be called blackmail, into giving millions of dollars to the BLM movement. Last count I looked at online, there was almost $500 million collected by BLM, and there's no accounting for that money. With the success of this movement, BLM and the founders have gained status and extreme political power. Our politicians on both sides seem to be falling all over themselves to give in to these groups. I'm personally very tired of being silent. It seems we're in trouble if we're silent, and we're in trouble if we're outspoken on any of this. The country's being manipulated. The left has created a perfect storm. With a clear target in our own community, I believe we should act. The timing couldn't be better. There are very few students on the campus. We could form a protest to the admin office and demand dismissal of this divisive individual from the staff of the college.
Okay, so at this point he talks about organizing a protest on Prescott College over the summer, and at which point there were very few students on campus. I can attest to that. That is very true. There were almost nobody on campus at the time. This protest never actually happened, but I do think it's kind of a low blow to show up when there's nobody on campus and just hold up a bunch of signs. It actually was kind of silly, because when I say nobody on campus, I mean literally nobody. Like, there weren't even many staff on campus at all, so they would have just been hanging around empty buildings. But again, like, I think it's kind of a silly idea that didn't come to fruition to begin with. But I mean, it's, you know, it's their right to do that. I believe it's actually private property, ironically enough, which many of these people defend so wholeheartedly. So I'm not sure if technically they could even come onto the campus, but they could have gone on the sidewalk and held up their signs. I mean, like, you know, free speech. Like, I went to a protest yesterday. They could have done that too, but I just think it would have been ineffective. So, but anyway, more importantly, he sort of implies, actually basically just straight up says that Black Lives Matter is just a big scam to get your money, and that there is no, you know, systematic racism. And I mean, I already talked about, like, how that's not true with the systematic racism, and with you know, with the perception that, like, Black Lives Matter is, like, gonna take your money and then use it to, like, take over the country is just, I just think, blows it way out of proportion to what's actually going on. It's not about what these people think it's about. I just don't, you know, it's fear-mongering is what it is, and as a result, you know, these people arm themselves. You know, we had a kid, you know, kill protesters recently, come from out of state to do that, and it's just a result of, in large part, this fear-mongering, which, you know, turns out to not really be true. Are there extremists with guns who are politically on the left side? Sure, maybe there are. You know, I'm willing to admit that, like, there are extremists, no matter which, you know, political, socio-political, geographical, whatever side you're on. But I really don't think that they come close to representing, you know, the majority of people who believe in the movement. So, and this isn't just restricted to, like, Black Lives Matter either. We see this with feminism, for example. Like, so many people, so many women included, like, steer far away from calling themselves a feminist, because they think it's about, you know, coming at the expense of men, which isn't, you know, necessarily true. Most feminists that I talk to say no. In fact, it, you know, benefits men as well. It's about, you know, reaching gender equality, even if that is through equity, which I'll talk about the quality equity thing later on. But, you know, it's about, like, eliminating gender norms and expectations entirely, that, like, men have to be this or that as well, not just, you know, women have to be this or that as well. You know, these unfair expectations. But anyway, there you have it. Like, you know, the extremes, I think we're living in an age of extremists, and the perception that extremists are the majority, which isn't true, is leading to this divisiveness and these people arming themselves, and this you know, eventually leading to people getting shot at protests. So I think that's what I mean by dangerous speech that this guy is putting out, and we'll see more examples of these in the next clip.
And I just thanked her, but then I got 2 comments, and I don't know where these people live, but they said to me, well, we have to knock out white supremacy. I said, white supremacy does not live here in Prescott. Thank you very much.
So this is a commentator, or a person asking, open to question and comments in the audience. And white supremacy not living in Prescott, I think, is just ridiculous. White supremacy is alive and well here. It's not what these people think it is. White supremacy isn't necessarily something that is direct as, say, a white person, like beating up some scary black guy. It's not, it doesn't get expressed in such direct terms. It's done in very subtle ways. And I just don't, I just think it's ridiculous to suggest white supremacy doesn't exist in Prescott when you have a, vast, white majority out with their guns and their Trump flags, and they're doing this stuff. They accuse us of not having many people of color, or particularly black people in the protest. At least there were black people in the protest. I didn't see a single person of color among the mass amounts of Trump supporters at the BLM protest yesterday. I'm sorry, this podcast has been very tainted by my experience yesterday. It was quite a sight to behold if you want to look up a video of the Prescott Black Lives Matter protest that happened yesterday on September 4th. It was quite a spectacle, to say the least. Anyway, let's move on to the next clip. Give me just a second for this one here. Okie dokie.
While doing so, they coerced many U.S. corporations, and this could be called blackmail, into giving millions of dollars to the BLM movement. Last count I looked at online, there was almost $500 million collected by BLM, and there's no accounting for that money. With the success of this movement, BLM and the founders have gained status.
Oh, wait a minute, I already did that one. My bad. But yeah, it's that isn't actually the clip I intended to get to, but anyway, let's move on.
You're not going to be able to organize. You can get people like me to come out and talk against it all day long. Remember, socialism, communism, one is looking for an AK, one has already got an AK. That's all they are.
Okay, so this is just another example of their serious perceived threats of all of us, Black Lives Matter supporters, and all of us, leftists even in general, you're looking for an AK, that the only difference between socialism and communism is that, one of them is ready to fight you and assert their dominance, and the other one is looking to do that. And I don't think that's the way it is at all. Been saying earlier, we're not the ones who are generally heavily armed and out promoting our Second Amendment rights and whatnot. This is just a big fear-mongering tactic. And I just don't think there's such reason to be as afraid as these people are. And furthermore, I guess I can talk about socialism, capitalism, communism, and Marxism a little bit here. These people think that anything that resembles social welfare is automatically socialism, and we're subject for a hostile takeover of the country. That is not true. Equity is what we want. I don't speak I don't speak for like everybody, but I think it really is more about making the necessary steps and changes it takes to reach a state of true equality through equity. These people are equalists, as I personally call them. They think that we're already living in a country or even in a world where there is no racism, or it's not a big deal, or it goes away if we just say it doesn't exist. That laws we put out, for example, drug laws that contribute to mass incarceration of largely people of color, right? That the result of that is very much a racist result, but yet the laws are the same for everybody. So you see a lack of equity there, which results in a lack of equality. So you can't just say we're all equal and then suddenly we're all equal. Of course we're all equal in a conceptual sense, but are we equal in a and even in a legal sense, I might add, but are we equal in the results of those policies? No, we're not. Otherwise we wouldn't have the problems that we have today. So I really, it's just gross to me that these people, seem to so heavily, wholeheartedly believe in unrestrained, unregulated, capitalism. We have a massive wealth gap, and we have people on the streets, in poverty. What do you call that? Do you call that, equality? Do you call that, anti, socialism, anti-capitalism? Do you call that a good, system of government? Because I don't. I don't see, good results from this extreme way of thinking that that paints any sort of social welfare, any sort of social policies that try to establish some sort of social justice, right? Think about Superfund sites and stuff like that as communist even. I think that's just an unfortunate extremification of what's going on. This whole episode is all about extremification, and how it leads to ultimately to violence, conspiracy theories, and alt-right people. These people aren't necessarily alt-right. They may be very conservative, maybe even far-right, but they're not necessarily buying into conspiracy theories that they've got to take action immediately and shoot up people. But as we'll see, they actually are to a certain degree. Some of them are, as we'll get into in some more examples here. Okay, so moving on. I didn't talk about Marxism. I guess I'll talk about their Marxism real quick as well. I think the part of Marxism they're talking about is, again, the idea of a class struggle, and the idea of seeing things in an intersectional way, seeing people for their race, for their gender, for their age, etc., and taking that into consideration in how you interact with them, right? They consider that's, I think that kind of thinking in terms of positionality, intersectionality, is what they consider Marxism. And again, that acts as sort of a shield for white supremacy. This way, if we're all equal under the law, we don't have to do anything about it because we're already in a state of equality, which is simply untrue. So again, I don't like the way what they consider to be Marxism. I don't like how they use that as a justification for not only inaction, but action that promotes bigotry, racism, sexism, etc. is what I mean by that. Okay, next clip.
When we first introduced it at the national level, they didn't want to even talk about it. What are you talking about? A civil war in the United States? Are you crazy? And I'm sure there were people out there who thought Jim Arroyo was completely psychotic because he's training his people to be ready for a civil war in the United States. Now the only thing that's going through their little pea brains is the blues and the grays on horses with cannons and guys with muskets all marching on line. This is what's in their head.
So again, they're ready to fight. They think it's going to get escalated to civil war, and they think that people who think that's ridiculous have pea brains and stuff like this. I'm going to speed up here and wrap things up because we're getting close to 45 minutes. I think I'll skip a clip or two here to get to some of the more ones that I think are deserve some more attention. I'll do this one. Here we go.
So to make a blanket statement that white people are all racist, and the Oath Keepers, the biggest anti-government racist militia, right-wing conspiracy-laden maniacs. Well, don't forget that, yeah, we're terrorists too, on top.
So, Oath Keepers do strike me as, as terrorists. Like, I'm not saying they are terrorists, but like, the way they arm themselves, the way they, even if they do it in a very defensive sounding way, is still rather, intimidating, that these people are ready to shoot me if I, do something they perceive as like anti-establishment, anti-status quo, anti-constitution, whatever they're thinking, so that, I do find that to be a threatening sentiment. But anyway, again, like, these people perceive themselves as like not being racist, and like they can't possibly be biased or bigoted or be supporting said systems, which I think is a very I think they're just wrong about that. On one hand, I do see where they're coming from with blanket statements. I do think those are tricky. To say all white people are racist could be true, depending on how you define racism. But that's the thing. Well, when you do that, like, well, does it give us an excuse to be racist? If we're all going to be racist anyway, why don't I just go do something, very, very bad to a person of color, if I'm going to be racist anyway, what does it matter? So I do think, there's something to be said about blanket statements, but to believe that he doesn't, or that white people aren't part of the problem or don't benefit from a system that includes racism is just foolish. Okay, one last clip and then we'll wrap this thing up. Here we go.
It's good that we're all organizing and we're talking and everything, but not everybody gets it. And I want to know if we, or you, Oath Keepers, are you in contact with the governors and the mayors? Is everybody working together? And why are we waiting for them to come after us?
Okay.
If we know what they're saying, and they're saying it on TV,
Right.
I saw it myself, how are they allowed to get away with it and threaten us? And then we're supposed to sit here and just hope that we can protect them?
Okay, so the question is, are we in touch with the governors, the mayors, and...
Okay, Jim Arroyo does address this, and he says they cannot respond to a perceived threat. But then the commentator in the audience does respond saying, well, this isn't a perceived threat, right? This is a real threat that they're making. No, it's a perceived threat. And I think Jim Arroyo knows this, even though he's sort of participating in this whole scheme of fear-mongering. He doesn't want to be responsible for taking the first shot, because as he says in his own words, I didn't get to this clip, but he says in his own words, we lose the moral high ground if we strike first. And he says, God forbid a crazy alt-right guy goes out and shoots up people, because then we're going to lose the moral high ground. So I mean, this is a scheme, like this is truly, talk about conspiracies, right? But it is, this is scary. This is extremely scary and concerning to me, and I think it should be for you too, my listener, because, this, as we see from this person in the audience, from what they're saying, they really think that, like, we are out to get them, right? Or that, like, these groups, these Black Lives Matter groups, etc., are out to show up with assault rifles and take over their homes, right? Like, they perceive this as something that's right on their doorstep. I've talked to some local people here, and I mean this, like, I'm not exaggerating. Like, this is the way that people think about this situation, and it's fear. Like I said earlier, it's fear mongering, it's alarmist, it's defensive, and it's reactionary And I just really don't think it's healthy at all. So that's my take on this meeting of the Yavapai County Preparedness Team and the Oath Keepers as well. I want to, at this point, just say that my future podcast will be a bit more relevant to, I think, my average listener. I'll be talking about more national figures that I mentioned earlier. I have Prager U, Jordan Peterson, Ben Shapiro lined up, as well as a few others I can't remember off the top of my head, but those are the people I want to get to first. My name is James Alter, and this has been the White Knight Podcast. We can be found on Podbean or on YouTube, and thank you very much for listening.